Patterns of thinking and Jesus' patterns of acting are in accordance with God's will. God the Father has a will for humanity, and that is for restoration, to be together again after the fall. The story of the Garden of Eden, when things were separated between God and humanity, God is saying, since that time till now, I want to be back in relationship with you. And I wanted to start off by telling a little story today. One morning, there was this mother, and she walks into the bedroom, and I imagine some of you may have had this experience. She walks into the bedroom of her children. It's a day where they have to go to school, and she starts stirring them up. Get up, it's time to go to school. And they slowly move. They're stretching and wiping the sleep from their eyes, and their clothes are all laid out and in order, and everything's at the foot of the bed, ready for them to get dressed and to go. And it wasn't too much unlike that for me this morning. 5 minutes before service, Kate was like, "Get up! What are you doing? It's time to get up." She's like, "It's church," and I was like, "What?" She's like, "You're the priest. You have to be there." And so after the poking and the prodding of the children and the getting up, they finally come around. They brush their teeth. They comb their hair. She has made breakfast for them. They eat their breakfast. They go out the door with their backpacks full of books and everything they need, folders and pencils and paper and their lunch bag. And everything looks like it's going to be a normal day. And they take a short bus ride to the school. And the oldest of the children, they sit down at their desk. It's a little boy. He sits at his desk, and he begins to learn the way the teacher wants and things. And then it becomes lunchtime. So he grabs his lunch, and he starts to go to the cafeteria where they're eating. And right as he's the last person to get there, there's another boy in his class that is standing in the door. And he says, "Give me your lunch, or else." And so the boy is afraid, and he doesn't know what to do. So he says, "Here's my lunch." And he gives him his lunch. And then that boy takes it and begins to eat his lunch. And the other boy goes without. After all of that preparation that has been done, that boy doesn't have his lunch. And so the day continues on. Normally, they go back to class, and the children come home on the bus the way they do. And Mom, she notices that her oldest son is very strange. He's not acting the way he normally does. Seems very quiet. And when they have dinner time, he just scarfs down his food. He eats it as fast as he's ever done, and she notices how hungry he is. And she starts to ask, "What's wrong? Something's wrong right now. I can tell you're acting different, and you're very hungry." And the boy's like, "I'm fine." And the way only mothers can do, she keeps pushing and asking the right questions. And saying, "What's happened? Something's happened. You need to tell me." Mothers like that. And he finally tells her that this boy took my lunch. And she goes from just very concerned to, like angry, all the things you might experience. How could someone do this to my child? And she starts to think about all of the things that's going wrong, and how, where was the principal? Where were the teachers? Who would let this boy? Do I contact the school? Do I call his parents because they all know each other? Do I call this mother and father and say, "Hey, here's what your son did to my son. What do I do?" And she was up all night stirring, right? The way you do, because you care about your children, and you can't rest until they're happy. That's the way she was thinking. And so she couldn't sleep. She stayed up all night, and then the day came and started again. Get up, time to go to school, time to get everything, get your clothes on, brush your teeth, eat your breakfast, and then take your backpack, here's your lunches, y'all go to school. And so it started just like the same way that the previous day had gone. And the boy goes to school, and he's very scared. And he gets up and he gets delayed again, and so he's the last one, and the other boy's in the doorway blocking him again, and he says, "Give me your lunch." And the boy reached into his backpack and he pulled out a lunch with that boy's name on it. And he said, "My mother thought you might be hungry, and so she made a lunch for you." And then the two boys sat down together and they ate lunch together. They became friends. Jesus acts the way that is the will of the Father, which is to bring people together to worship God and to care for one another. When we say the great commandment, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself, the whole point of the gospel of Jesus is to bring the fallen world back together as best we can. And so we don't act in malice. We don't act in mal. In Spanish, mal is bad. We don't act in malice in bad ways. But rather, instead of fighting fire with fire, what's the best thing to fight fire with? Water. So to bring peace to those times of conflict, we need to think differently than the way humanity typically thinks in our fallen nature. And we must then act in accordance in that same way, to fight fire with water and not fire. Today's gospel is a teaching where Jesus is in the synagogue, in the house of God's, where God worships, or where we worship God. In the gospel, he reads this wonderful passage from Isaiah. Don't let anyone tell you, this has been going on for decades and decades. They'll say that the Old Testament is about law and the New Testament is about grace. If you just read the Isaiah passage that talked about grace, about how we are to treat one another, there's tons of grace in the Old Testament. The Old Testament is the scripture that Jesus read. So don't you think maybe there might be some things in the Old Testament that Jesus picks up on where he reiterates? In fact, the great commandment, love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself, is in the Old Testament. Jesus is just quoting it. But in Isaiah, he's talking about loosing the bonds, about freeing people from the things that are sinful. If you pay close attention here, Jesus is teaching in the synagogue, and he sees, it doesn't quite say if she had come up to it, the woman had come up to him, or if he's just looking through and he sees this woman and he knows that something's wrong. And he says, "Come here. Come here." And he does something very challenging to the people who are sitting there who get everything right all the time, the rule followers. I'm not a rule follower. Well, I'm a rule follower when it's easy for me. If it's not easy for me, I bend the rules sometimes. But Jesus would normally be a rule follower. But when the rule doesn't actually match what God is saying, then he pushes back against those rules. And I want to point out again, I said this last week, Jesus is often thought of, in our time particularly, as someone who pushes against political power. Where is he in this story? He's in the synagogue. He's pushing back against religious power. His whole ministry was pushing back against those who would put the yoke on God's people for their own power. But rather, he pushes back against the religious powers. So, what he says here in Luke's gospel, Luke tells us this over and over again. He uses the word leue, which is to loosen. It's a Greek word, to loosen or to untie. And Luke uses that word over and over again when he tells this story. The woman is actually tied up. The way she is bound in her infirmity is she's tied up. And Jesus, when he says to set her free from the ailment, he literally says, untie her from the infirmity. Then the leader of the synagogue, he complains. What have you done? Jesus defends his actions. He says, he uses that word again, you untie, luei, you untie an oxen on the Sabbath day. This is an animal. How can you not treat your brother or sister in a better way than you treat your animals? How do you not know this naturally? And in light of this great miracle, it seems difficult to understand why this leader would even have a problem, because if you had seen someone who had been miraculously healed, wouldn't you go, yes, thank you to God. We're so glad that you're here and you're present and you're doing wonderful things. But his response isn't like that. But if you understand, in their time, you didn't heal. You didn't do any work on the Sabbath. There are still Jewish traditions that if you go to an apartment in New York City and they have an elevator, the elevator is programmed to stop at every floor all day long, because it's considered work to push a button to go to your floor. Right? So in the very strict Orthodox Jewish traditions, that's how strict. That's work. You can't do that. So you get on and you go up to floor 2, floor 3, floor 4. You're on 10 or 18. Ooh, it's going to take forever. That's sometimes not. That's the mentality that they had in that time. You can do no work. But here, Jesus is saying, this is not work. This is freedom. This is loosing the bonds of someone who is in labor and in pain. She's been tied up. Think about this, 18 years. A person in the average age in that time was about 30, a little more than 30 years. Someone would live. Could you imagine half of your life being tied up in this way? Half of your life. This leader was indignant. And now here's the interesting thing too. I love the way Jesus unfolds this story, and Luke tells it to us, is that it's only one person who says anything. It's the leader of the synagogue. You should have done this. There are 6 other days of the week. She's been bound up 18 years. Why couldn't you just wait another day? No big deal. It's a big deal for her, but not for the rest of us, right? But Jesus responds to that. Not just to the one person who makes the comment, but you hypocrites. It's everyone who is thinking that way. Everyone who is saying, you could have waited another day. Tomorrow's Sunday. You could wait until Sunday. She's been up like this for 18 years. But for the woman, as soon as she is untied, she stands up straight and she praises God. And I think it's true for the crowd as well. When the weight of religious rules and practices prevents us from praising God and from doing the work and living out the gospel by loving our neighbor, if something is preventing us from doing that, we must be loosened from it, released from it. So the weight of the religious rules keeps us from doing what God wants us to do. We must release from that. When we have a preconceived idea of the right way to deal with conflict, like our natural disposition, like in the story of the mother who says, I have to defend my child, what does she do? She offers an entirely different, all the other options that we often think are right before us. Call the principal, call the teacher, call the parent of the other. What does she do? She's probably stirring all night praying, God, what do I do as a follower of you? And what does God do? He leads with grace and love and mercy. What is the problem? So maybe whenever there's conflict, we say, what is the problem? This child is taking my child's lunch. Maybe he's hungry. How do I fill that? You see, you do this every month with the food pantry. You do this every week with the thrift shop. What if these people that need clothing or need other things to get through life? See, grace is doing the work that God has called grace to do. And you lead with the love and mercy. Why do we do things? This is also important. We don't do things just because they're nice. We do things because they glorify our God and Father in heaven. Giving people an option for things that they might need in this life is God's grace in that moment. It's not just, here's some stuff. Here are some things that you might otherwise not have. Here's some food which you might not otherwise have. This is God's work, and grace is doing it amazingly. So then, what does that mean for us? in times of conflict, in times where the world is preventing us and pushing back against us from doing the work that God has called us to do. Sit back, stir all night, reflect on what the problem is, and then discover the grace that God has for that person. And you will find, like in the story, there will be some people that won't accept it. That's a reality. They killed Jesus and he did everything right. But for those who are truly hurting and need to be untied and need to be freed from whatever ailment they have, for those that you extend grace to, you'll change their life and you make them your friend. So, as followers of Jesus, and as Jesus walks in the life of the Father and does the things he sees the Father doing, so you do as well.